April 1945. Northern Germany lay in ruins, a land of broken roads, burned-out villages, and silence heavy with surrender. The British convoy rolled through the morning fog, engines coughing in the cold air. Mud splashed across faded insignias as trucks halted beside a makeshift wire enclosure. Inside, figures stood motionless, not soldiers in defiance, but women in tattered Wehrmacht uniforms, their faces pale beneath smudges of ash and fear. The guards stepped down slowly, rifles slung but hands uncertain. This was no ordinary prisoner column. No one had briefed them for this. The sight of German women, some barely in their 20s, trembling as they awaited command. Smoke drifted from a nearby barn, where the war's last gunfire had echoed only hours earlier. One British sergeant removed his helmet, staring at the women through the rising mist. The silence that followed was heavier than battle. For the first time in months of combat, the soldiers didn't know what to do next, and that uncertainty would lead to one of the most unexpected orders of the war. By the beginning of 1945, the Third Reich was living on borrowed time. From the east came the relentless surge of the Red Army. From the west, the British, Americans, and Canadians crossed the Rhine with a precision that shattered what remained of German resistance. Entire divisions surrendered without orders, while others disintegrated before ever reaching the front. Northern Germany was a portrait of chaos. Roads once used for military convoys were now rivers of civilians. Mothers pushing carts, children wrapped in rags, wounded soldiers limping beside horse-drawn wagons. The Luftwaffe had almost ceased to exist. Fuel was gone, and airfields stood silent except for the echo of Allied bombers overhead. Town after town burned under the constant thunder of artillery, leaving nothing but chimneys and smoke to mark their names. The Nazi administration, so disciplined in its rise, fell apart in confusion and fear. Local Gauleiters vanished. Command posts were abandoned. SS officers burned records and disappeared into the flood of refugees. Even in Berlin, Hitler's inner circle quarreled over who was to blame as the Red Army closed in. Across the country, surrender became an unspoken word, forbidden by propaganda, but practiced by everyone. In the British sector, the Second Army advanced through Lower Saxony and into Schleswig-Holstein. The countryside offered little resistance. Villages hung white sheets from windows, desperate symbols of surrender. British patrols found themselves not fighting but collecting prisoners, hundreds, then thousands, each one gaunt, exhausted, and ready to trade a rifle for a ration. Among these columns of defeated soldiers were figures that startled even the most seasoned officers. Women, wearing fragments of Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe uniforms, appeared among the prisoners. Some claimed to be nurses or clerks. Others said nothing. They stood quietly, avoiding the gaze of the men around them. No one in the British ranks had been prepared for this. By April, the war's moral landscape was collapsing as completely as its military one. Every town liberated revealed another layer of human misery. Labor camps, makeshift hospitals, and civilian shelters filled with survivors of the Reich's vast machinery. The British soldiers, hardened by years of combat, were now walking through the physical and moral wreckage of a defeated empire. In that world of surrender and survival, the distinction between soldier, civilian, and victim grew painfully thin. The war had created millions of displaced souls, among them women bound to the German military in ways few outside had ever seen. And soon, on a cold morning near the war's end, British guards would come face to face with the living proof of that hidden system. Behind the front lines of the Wehrmacht, another, lesser-known structure operated, one that spoke not of tactics or technology, but of human exploitation. As early as 1940, the German High Command had established a network of military brothels, officially termed Wehrmachtsbordelle. Their existence was justified under the language of maintaining discipline and preventing disease. but the reality was far darker. Women were brought in from occupied territories: France, Poland, the Netherlands, and the Soviet Union. Many under false promises of work or medical duty. Others were taken directly from labor or concentration camps. They were examined, registered, and placed under military supervision, forced to serve soldiers rotating through the front. In some regions, the SS maintained its own controlled houses, separate from the regular army, while field units improvised crude equivalents in captured villages. By 1944, as the war turned against Germany, these systems spread into retreating zones. The German command viewed comfort stations as necessary for morale, even as cities burned and divisions vanished. Records recovered after the war showed that the Wehrmacht maintained dozens of such facilities across occupied Europe, often disguised as rest centers or Red Cross stations. In truth, they were prisons. Many of the women, particularly those assigned near front-line areas, were issued partial Wehrmacht uniforms to blend in and avoid detection by civilians. Others were recorded as auxiliary staff, a term that blurred the line between combat support and coerced service. When the Allies advanced into these regions, they encountered these women, not as civilians but as part of military units, creating confusion about their identity and status under the laws of war. British and American troops entering liberated areas in early 1945 documented scenes that challenged every moral expectation of the war. In some abandoned barracks, they found registers listing women's names, ages, and medical examinations. In others, they discovered makeshift hospital rooms with patients marked only as reassigned personnel. Few reports made it into official communiques. The topic was considered too sensitive, too scandalous for public release. But for the soldiers who stumbled upon these places, the shock was unforgettable. They had come to defeat an army, not to witness the machinery of degradation it had built within itself. And when British units reached northern Germany, they found remnants of that system among the surrendering troops. Women in uniform, uncertain whether they would be treated as prisoners or as evidence. Their presence in POW camps presented an immediate dilemma. The British Army, bound by the Geneva Convention, could not mistreat prisoners regardless of their past. Yet the question remained: who were these women? Victims of war or collaborators in its crimes? In the chill of April 1945, that question would hang heavily over one small British camp, until a single order, unexpected and humane, defined the answer. When the first group of British guards entered the camp, they expected the usual chaos of surrender: tired soldiers, discarded weapons, and the hollow eyes of defeat. Instead, they found something that stopped them in silence. The prisoners before them were women, some wearing patched Wehrmacht tunics, others wrapped in blankets, their faces half hidden behind hair unwashed for days. The guards lowered their rifles, exchanging uneasy glances. There was no manual for this. For men who had spent years fighting through North Africa, Italy, and France, the enemy had always been a man with a weapon. Now, that enemy stood trembling, broken, and feminine. The guards' first instinct was suspicion. Propaganda had taught them that German women serving in uniform were fanatics or spies. But what they saw here did not fit that image. These women were not defiant. They were defeated in a deeper sense. A British corporal, barely 23, later recalled, "They looked like ghosts, not soldiers. We didn't know where to look or what to say." For the German women, humiliation came in waves. Captured by those they had been taught to hate, stripped of the protection of their own army, they now faced judgment for crimes they had never chosen. Many had served in Wehrmacht-controlled comfort units, a euphemism for forced sexual service under military regulation. They were not combatants, but neither were they free. Now, in British custody, they feared the worst: retaliation, exposure, or silence. The uniforms they wore were symbols of shame. Removing them meant facing the world bare, yet keeping them meant bearing the mark of the enemy. Some tried to speak. Most did not. The trauma of years spent under coercion had turned their voices inward. Their fear was not of bullets, but of being seen, of recognition, of judgment. One British officer noted in his field report that the women refused rations at first, assuming they were poisoned, a tragic reflection of how deeply mistrust and abuse had shaped their world. For the commanders, the dilemma was immediate and profound. The Geneva Convention made no clear distinction for such a case. The women, technically registered as military auxiliaries, were to be treated as POWs. But what if they were victims of a war crime themselves? Medical officers advised separation, while intelligence staff demanded interrogation. Yet, among the British leadership, a different concern began to grow. The moral tone of victory. Orders came down the line. The prisoners were to be treated with dignity, guarded but unharmed. There would be no humiliation, no exploitation, no repetition of the system they had escaped. In that moment, military restraint became an act of moral defiance. And it was this restraint, this refusal to mirror the enemy's cruelty, that would soon define the camp's next, most shocking order. As news of these encounters reached the press, the story was filtered through lenses of national pride and moral framing. In Britain and America, newspapers were eager for accounts of enemy surrender and Allied virtue. Reports described the discovery of women in Wehrmacht, service with restraint and cautious language, often emphasizing British professionalism and fairness. Headlines praised soldiers who refused to indulge in revenge or maintained discipline under extraordinary circumstances. Yet, much of the reality, the coerced nature of these women's service, the psychological damage endured, was softened or omitted entirely. The press preferred a narrative that reinforced moral superiority rather than the complexities of human suffering. The moral angle within the British ranks was equally charged. Officers and guards were conscious that revenge could be easy. A moment's lapse could reproduce the abuse these women had already endured. But discipline prevailed. For the British, the war had not only been about defeating an enemy, but also about demonstrating that victory need not mirror cruelty. Orders such as, "We won't take our clothes off," became emblematic of a broader ethical stance. Restraint in the midst of power. It was a quiet rebellion against the dehumanization that had fueled years of conflict, a deliberate choice to assert humanity over instinct. Yet, despite the significance of these moments, historical records remain surprisingly silent. Official POW reports mention the women only as auxiliary personnel or non-combatants, with few details of their treatment or emotional state. Diaries, letters, and after-action reports hint at discomfort and shock, but public acknowledgement was almost non-existent. The silence reflects both the stigma surrounding sexual exploitation in wartime and the reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths about the enemy and even the victors. For decades, these encounters remained footnotes in broader narratives of victory, known only through scattered testimonies and rare archival discoveries. The convergence of propaganda, moral restraint, and historical silence created a paradox, an event that was both extraordinary and nearly invisible. For the soldiers on the ground, it was a defining moment of conscience. For the women, it was a fragile reprieve from a system of coercion. And for history, it became a quiet testament to the ethical complexities of war, the ways human beings negotiate morality when survival, power, and trauma collide. This moral tension would soon crystallize in the camp's decisive moment, the turning point where orders would shock everyone involved and leave an indelible mark on those present. It was early April 1945, and the camp lay under a gray sky that seemed to press down on the barbed wire fences. The British officers had organized a routine medical inspection, standard procedure for prisoners of war. Soldiers marched the captives into rows, Medics prepared tables, clipboards in hand. Everything was procedural, methodical, a rehearsal of discipline in the midst of disorder. The women, trembling, stood in line. Some pressed their arms against their bodies, uncertain whether to obey or resist. Their uniforms, torn and mismatched, betrayed the past months of enforced labor and coercion. British officers initially treated the process as a matter of efficiency. Check for lice, assess health, ensure no weapons or disease would spread. Nothing about the inspection suggested moral ambiguity, but as officers began reviewing records, something shifted. Names appeared: German, Polish, Dutch. Some women had been forcibly conscripted into the Wehrmacht's auxiliary services. Others had been coerced into the so-called comfort units. The realization struck the British command like a cold wind. These were not voluntary soldiers. These were victims of an organized system of exploitation, the living evidence of a wartime atrocity carefully hidden behind euphemisms and uniforms. A sergeant lowered his clipboard, his hand trembling. They didn't choose this," he whispered to his officer. The medical tables became a stage for moral reckoning. Every step forward, the unbuttoning of tunics, the examination of frail bodies, suddenly felt like complicity in the very abuse they had come to punish. The commanding officer called the inspection to a halt. Medics stepped back. Guards relaxed their rifles but did not lower their vigilance. Silence hung over the camp, heavier than any artillery fire they had faced. No one spoke for several minutes. The British soldiers, trained for violence and efficiency, now faced the profound complexity of human suffering. Their decision was immediate yet monumental. They would not replicate the coercion they had discovered. In that moment, the camp became more than a holding area. It became a moral arena. The act of restraint, of stopping the inspection and treating the women with dignity despite confusion, shock, and lingering anger, marked a turning point in both procedure and conscience. It was here, in the midst of surrender and chaos, that a quiet yet decisive defiance of cruelty emerged, setting the stage for the unforgettable order that would soon define the camp. The halt of the medical inspection left the camp in tense stillness. Soldiers shifted uneasily, medics packed away instruments, and the women remained in their uniforms, unsure whether the pause signaled mercy or further scrutiny. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken questions. How should victors treat those who had been both prisoners and coerced participants in a system of abuse? A young British corporal, observing the women's fear and fragility, broke the silence. He spoke to his peers. "We're not here to repeat what they've suffered. We won't take our clothes off for them or humiliate them. That's not our war." The line, simple yet defiant, spread quickly among the guards. It became a tacit command: preserve dignity, maintain discipline, and reject the cycle of degradation that had characterized so much of the conflict. For the women, the gesture was bewildering. After months of coerced service, enforced exposure, and constant surveillance, they had learned to anticipate only cruelty. To be met with restraint and moral courage was disorienting, almost incomprehensible. Some wept quietly, not from relief alone, but from the overwhelming realization that they had not yet lost all humanity. The British officers reinforced the principle. Orders were given that no soldier was to exploit or demean the prisoners. Rations and blankets were distributed with care, and medical care was provided without inspection of shame. Guards patrolled with eyes alert, but hearts restrained. The camp, once a space of potential humiliation, became a place where morality held sway over impulse, where professional discipline upheld the humanity of both captor and captive. In the days that followed, the story of restraint spread quietly among the British units. Soldiers recalled the moment as a lesson in ethical warfare, that even amidst the chaos of total war, conscience could prevail. The phrase, "we won't take our clothes off," became emblematic. a shorthand for the moral choice made in that gray, rain-slicked camp in northern Germany. And while the war outside raged toward its final conclusion, within the barbed wire of that small camp, a profound statement had been made. Victory need not mirror cruelty, and discipline could honor, rather than degrade, the human spirit. In the weeks following their capture, the women remained under British custody, though the approach to their treatment had changed profoundly. Instead of routine inspections or forced processing, officers implemented measures that balanced security with care. Medical personnel provided checkups for malnutrition, disease, and injuries, all conducted with the utmost discretion. Rations and warm clothing were distributed, and the women were allowed privacy to preserve their dignity. The guards, reminded daily of the moral precedent set in the camp, ensured that no abuse or humiliation occurred. Archival. Records from the British Army note their presence as female auxiliaries, or non-combatants, with little elaboration on their identities or past assignments. The sparse documentation reflected both prudence and discomfort. The Army recognized the women's coerced involvement, but also understood the sensitivity of exposing the details. Interviews conducted decades later with former British officers reveal the lasting impression these prisoners left. One sergeant remembered, "I could never forget the way they looked at us. Terrified, but not broken. It was like looking at the consequences of a war we had to fight with both strength and restraint." For the women themselves, survival remained paramount. Many were repatriated to their home countries or transferred to Allied refugee centers, though the journey was complicated by stigma. Former members of the so-called comfort units faced suspicion, sometimes even from their own families or local communities, despite having been coerced. Psychologists today interpret these experiences as acute trauma. Humiliation, fear, and prolonged exploitation had left emotional scars that persisted long after liberation. Yet in official histories, these encounters are almost entirely absent. The silence of records and omission from public reports reflected broader societal discomfort with wartime sexual exploitation, even when the victims were among the defeated enemy. For historians piecing together the events, it is only through oral histories, scattered archives, and personal memoirs that the story survives. The moral restraint shown by the British during this period was not a grand gesture, but a quiet decision repeated daily. By choosing dignity over retribution, the officers and guards created a small, protected space amid the chaos of the war's final months. This care would ripple through post-war policies and set precedents for handling prisoners, particularly those whose involvement in conflict blurred the lines between coercion and complicity. And it was this foundation of humanity that informed the next stage of post-war reflection: how British POW handling protocols evolved and influenced military ethics for decades to come. The experience of managing the German women. Prisoners left a lasting imprint on British military policy. Officers recognized that standard POW procedures, while legally sound, were insufficient for situations involving coercion, trauma, and moral ambiguity. The handling of these women highlighted a need for protocols that balanced security with humanity, an approach that would influence both training and doctrine in the post-war years. Official reports emphasized respect for prisoners' dignity, particularly for those whose involvement in the conflict was involuntary. British commanders documented lessons learned, the importance of separating combatants from non-combatants, providing medical and psychological care, and ensuring that no punitive measures were applied without clear evidence of voluntary participation in crimes. These policies reinforced adherence to the Geneva Convention while introducing practical guidance for morally complex scenarios. The ripple effect extended beyond policy documents. Training programs for British forces in subsequent decades incorporated ethical decision-making under pressure. Officers were taught to evaluate not only tactical threats, but also the human context of captured personnel. The notion that victory did not require moral compromise became central to British military culture, influencing conduct in later conflicts, including Korea, Malaya, and the Falklands. Scholars of military ethics point to the April 1945 camp as a seminal example. The refusal to humiliate the women, symbolized by the now famous line, "We won't take our clothes off," became a case study in restraint and moral courage. It demonstrated that discipline could coexist with compassion, and that upholding human dignity was a strategic as well as ethical imperative. The post-war treatment of these prisoners also shaped international discourse on sexual exploitation in conflict. While immediate recognition was limited, the principles established by the British set a precedent for later conventions and policies addressing the protection of vulnerable populations in war zones. The emphasis on separating coercion from voluntary participation became a guiding framework for humanitarian law and military jurisprudence. In retrospect, the camp near northern Germany was more than a temporary holding site. It became a proving ground for ethical warfare, where human conscience was tested alongside military discipline. The lessons learned there echoed far beyond the end of World War II, influencing both the conduct of soldiers and the evolving understanding of what it means to fight a just war. In the quiet aftermath of Europe's devastation, the camp in northern Germany stands as a subtle testament to the endurance of conscience amidst chaos. War strips away certainty, leaving soldiers to confront not only the enemy, but their own capacity for action. In that gray April morning of 1945, the British Guards faced a choice: replicate cruelty or uphold humanity. Their decision to restrain, to protect rather than humiliate, became an unspoken moral victory. The women, coerced into service and caught in the machinery of a collapsing regime, bore witness to this rare mercy. Their survival was measured not only in physical safety, but in the preservation of dignity, a fragile shield against years of imposed degradation. For them, and for the soldiers who guarded them, that moment crystallized a profound truth. Even in war, human decency can assert itself. This single act of restraint echoes far beyond the barbed wire of a temporary POW camp. It illuminates the power of ethical choice under pressure, the courage required to resist vengeance, and the quiet strength inherent in disciplined compassion. History often records battles, strategies, and victories, but it is in moments like these, where morality is tested and preserved, that the essence of humanity shines most clearly. Though largely absent from official chronicles, the episode endures as a moral lesson that even amidst the most inhuman circumstances, acts of restraint and empathy define the true measure of civilization. The British officer's decision, simple in words yet profound in impact, reminds us that humanity need not be surrendered with the signing of treaties or the fall of empires.